We also have a seventh candle that Kati has asked to light today. If you can please, it's okay. It's for Kati. I'll hold it for you. Want to keep it?
Thank you for keeping the flame alive and helping one another and us to keep this beautiful flame alive.
So I think it's important. Okay, sure.
Thank you. So Kati Preston is here with us, and we're going to hear from her. We're also going to have time for some questions and answer at the end, because I'm sure that will be very meaningful to all of us. Kati will tell her story. I'm not going to. I just want to say she's a real treasure. I heard you a few months ago. You were speaking in Wayland, and I heard you, and I knew I would like to bring you over here to talk to our people. Kati has been advocating for Holocaust education all around the country, and especially in her home state of New Hampshire. Yeah, I really don't want to take any more of your time. Kati, please.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm holding this candle. I've actually lit this candle. Can you hear me? I lit this candle for the simple peasant girl who saved my life. I think she deserves a candle too, because she put her life in danger and she saved me and my children and my grandchildren, almost a whole generation. Her name was Erzsébet, which is a Hungarian, Elizabeth, and I just want to thank her in Hungarian. I always do this when I can. Köszönöm, Erzsébet, hogy megmentetted az életemet. Okay, my name is Kati Preston, and I've been speaking now for about, I would say 15 years. At least in this audience, I don't have to tell you why I'm speaking about the Holocaust. You know, thank God I don't have to give the whole introduction of how people forgot it and nobody knows about it and so on and so forth. I can just go and tell you about the rest of it now. I come from a very unusual family. My mother was a Catholic and my father was a Jew. And this, you know, in 1939, when I was born, this was a scandal. Both families promptly disowned them. And my mother converted to Judaism, hoping to please my father's very large Jewish family. There was 28 members of that family, including me. And of course, nobody wanted to know anything about it. And my parents were very happy together for the short time that they were able to live. And they were, for those days, very unusual. My mother was a dressmaker. People never bought clothes in a shop. None of you would remember that, you're all too young, but they didn't buy clothes in shops. They bought a piece of cloth and they went to a dressmaker to have it made. And she had 40 girls working for her. She had a big business and people were coming from all over the place. She was very talented and she was doing extremely well. My father, who was a slightly less enterprising sort of person, he had a fish business. There was a river that went through town and he had great big crates of carp that swam in these crates and he would wholesale them. And I remember there was always a carp swimming in our bath because we ate a lot of them. And as a little girl, I would go and talk to this carp and say, look, I'm so sorry we're going to eat you, but you're going to taste so good. And that's how I dealt with my guilt. And I had an absolutely wonderful childhood. For those days, my parents were very well off and we had everything, you know, and my room was like a palace, you know. I had so many feather beds. I used to have a little ladder to climb up into bed and hop in there. And there were beautiful lace hangings and silk all over the walls and every imaginable toy. And they made me sleep in little curlers so that my hair would be perfect in the morning. And they dressed me in lovely dresses with little lace collars and white lace tights and little Mary Jane shoes. And every morning I would be paraded in front of my mother's customers. And they would all say, oh, isn't she beautiful? And of course, I thought I was absolutely the center of the universe. I mean, obviously, I was terribly spoiled. And, you know, I loved my daddy. He was my hero. My daddy was tall, dark, and handsome. And today I would think he was a little bit over the top, but then I thought he was great. He would burst into the room singing opera at the top of his voice, and bellow it out. And, you know, he would pick me up and dance with me. And he was a very happy person. This is why I find it so strange that he's no longer, or that he died so young, because he was so happy. Just that happiness in itself should have been enough to keep him going. And, you know, he was different to other parents. In those days, children were tolerated at best, you know. We never considered them celebrated like children are nowadays. You know, a child had to be quiet and just grow up already. You know, there was no, it was an inconvenience to have a child, really. They just wanted them to grow up. And my daddy was different. He taught me every constellation. I still know all of them in Hungarian. And he sang to me, of course. He sang a lot. I still love opera, I must say. And you know, I just absolutely adored this man. He was a very good man. My mother was much more strict. It was always my daddy that let me get away with everything. And of course, I remember my mother lighting candles on a Friday night, and there wasn't very much religion in our house. And she would light these candles and she would mutter something in Hebrew. And I thought she was doing magic. I was only 4.5. I didn't know what she was doing. I was waiting for something to happen every time she lit these candles. But we didn't have that much celebration of religion. And because they didn't want to deprive me of Christmas, because all the children in the street had Christmas trees, I had one too. And every Christmas we had very tall trees and there was little candles on it. And of course, every Christmas we had a fire because you light a candle on a fir tree, whoosh. And whoops, and there were candles all over the tree. I don't know if this mic works. My ears are too small. Do you need bigger ears for this? You know what? I'm going to hold it. There we go. So anyway, we lit these candles and we had the fire. And I remember that wonderful smell of burning fir tree and the candies that would melt on the tree. It was beautiful. I really enjoyed that. And one Christmas, one of my mother's maids decided to take me to the local church to show me the nativity scene. And I stole baby Jesus. Thank you. Thank you. This is better. Thank you. Is it on? No, sure. This is better. Yes. I stole baby Jesus because he didn't have any clothes. And I wanted to take him home and put some doll's clothes and bring him back possibly. And my mother takes my coat off and she says, oh my God, they're going to say the Jews are stealing Jesus. Get back at once to this priest and apologize. And I was dragged back to the priest. And I remember walking into this room, and he was very tall and he had some long black garment. And I kept looking up, 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 and he was up there somewhere with a nose like a toucan. And this big bony finger, and he waves the finger at me saying, you're going to hell for stealing Jesus. It's enough to put anybody off religion. I never wanted to go near a church ever. I mean, even nowadays, I go past a church, I expect the devil to jump out at me. But, you know, to this very day, every time I go past one of those places, I'm so tempted, you know. But now they have barriers. They have other people like me. They have barriers outside. Anyway, at this point, they decided that they had a totally out of control 4.5-year-old and something had to be done. They got me a governess. Well, of course, you know, being in this small Transylvanian town where I come from, which I forgot to tell you about, you know, Transylvania, which is, it was Hungary during my persecution, now it's Romania. And all the Hungarians who lived there tended to be more in the German culture. So they got me a governess, an Austrian lady who spoke German, of course, and she was supposed to take me in hand and make me into a lady. And she arrived and she was tall and skinny and she had a bun on her head. And I don't think she had any lips because I never saw her smile. She had a slash for a mouth and she was very, very strict. And I had to have hard-boiled eggs under my armpits at the table so I wouldn't flap my wings, as she called it. And she tied a ruler behind me to the dining room chair with one string on my neck and another one on my waist for posture. Mind you, look at me, 85, I can still sit straight. I'm terrified of her. And this woman, Fräulein, as I called her, Miss in German, Fräulein was an absolute bitch. She really was. Sometimes I'm not supposed to say this in schools, but it does sometimes come out. But it happens. But this woman terrorized me. But in all fairness, she did teach me to read, write, and speak German in 6 months, which for a small child was something else. You know, but, you know, at least she did that, but it came at a terrible cost. And I would complain to my daddy and say, look, I don't like Fräulein. She doesn't let me play with the children in the street anymore. What am I can't stand her. And they said, no, my dear, you have to have a Fräulein to become a lady, because my parents wanted to bring me up properly. And I remember she would teach me table manners was like 8 forks and 8 knives. And I had to guess which one was for the fish and which one was for the chicken. And my God, I still know all that, but now I just have a fork. Big deal, you know. Anyway, so this woman terrorized me and I wasn't allowed to play with children in the street anymore. There was only one little boy I could play with. His name was Stefan, Istvanka was his name in Hungarian. And I was allowed to play with him because his parents were rich, because Fräulein was very snobby. And we used to run in front of the opera house. We had an opera house and it had a round driveway. And, you know, we were running up and down this driveway and the game was catching him. And every time I caught him, I kissed him. And I learned to run really fast. He was very cute and he hated it. And I kept grabbing him and kissing him. And I remember him wiping his little face. That was my only friend that I was allowed to play with. And then at this point, my parents decided to send me to a Hebrew class 2 mornings a week. Fräulein reluctantly took me there. And they taught me a few Hebrew songs there. And they explained to me that I was different from other children because I'm Jewish. I never thought of myself as being different until I was told that Jews are different. And I didn't experience that. The only joy I had in that little school was the little boy was there too. He was Jewish, you see. There were 52 children in this kindergarten and only 2 of us survived. In fact, I met the other person 50 years later, which is amazing. However, at this point, you know, things started to change. you know, when I speak in schools, often kids say to me, well, why did the Jews agree to go to concentration camp? Well, it wasn't like that. They started to take away our rights. And when the Nazis came to my hometown, it was, you know, we weren't that scared because it was a gradual thing. And by this time, we heard all about Poland. Hungary was the very last country to be persecuted, you know, because all the others were already gone. We were right at the end of the war. They were already losing the war, but they were diverting trains to take the Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz instead of feeding their soldiers. I mean, this is how obsessed they were. And they started changing things. Jews could no longer go to college. They couldn't teach in a college. Jews could no longer go to high school. Jewish doctors could no longer treat non-Jews. People in municipal jobs had to leave their jobs. They could no longer work there. And by this time, the large family forgave my parents and they would come to dinner. And there was 28 members in my Jewish family, me included. And I remember these long tables. And there was this large family and they were sort of bickering like all families do. This one isn't talking to that one because he forgot the birthday, you know. But it was wonderful because I was the youngest person there. And they were all these aunts and uncles and cousins, and they were all older than me, and they all made such a fuss of me. And my parents would show me off, and I would recite things in German, and they would go ooh and ah, and pat me on the head and call me clever and beautiful. And I loved this big, large Jewish family. They were lovely and noisy and happy. And then slowly, somehow, the moods in these dinners started to change. And I was hiding under the table listening to conversations, and one would say, well, Bondi had to leave college and now he can't go to college. And the other one had another problem. And they started to talk about perhaps we should leave. And then one of them would pipe up and say, why should we leave? We're Hungarians. They're going to protect us. I mean, we've been here for hundreds of years. The Hungarians were very assimilated. They were not. They were very patriotic, good Hungarians, just like you are Americans. You might be Jewish, but you consider yourself above all Americans. And you wouldn't imagine that America would let something like that happen to you. And, you know, nobody believed it. And we thought it was just communist propaganda. Nobody really believed it. And people were saying, well, yes, if we left, so where would we go? Well, there was nowhere to go. And by the time they really wanted to go, there was no possibility. And the Hungarians were very sneaky because what they did, knowing how obedient all these assimilated Hungarians are, they told everybody to register with the police. Every single person registered with the police so they would know where we lived. They could protect us, so they said. And we all registered with the police, and we were still a bit worried and waiting. And I was watching my mother, who was always happy, suddenly walk around with red eyes. And I'd say to her, why are you crying? And she said, I'm not crying. No, I have a cold. And they would stop talking when I came into a room. And, you know, kids pick up on this thing. And there was a feeling of gloom and doom, and everybody was getting worried. And then they built the ghetto. They took a very small, dilapidated part of town. There was 100,000 people living in Nagyvárad, my hometown at that time. 30,000 of them were Jews. And they built a tiny little ghetto and crammed everybody in there. There was like 15, 20 people to a room. It was a dismal place. Now, my mother, although she converted to Judaism, was not considered Jewish in the eyes of the Hungarians. They only considered us Jewish if we had Jewish blood, even if you had a grandparent who was Jewish. I was supposed to be Jewish because my father was Jewish, but my mother did not have to register with the police. And I remember the day that my daddy left for the ghetto. I walked into a room and they were holding each other. He had a coat and a hat and a little bag on the floor, and they were holding each other, sobbing. It was a love marriage, and they adored each other, and they were both crying so hard. And I remember sort of worming my way between them because I wanted to be part of everything. And I cried too, but I wasn't worried because daddy was going to come back. I mean, daddy always went on on trips and came home and brought me presents. And then he left, and my mother was inconsolable. And she kept crying, and I couldn't stop her. And then suddenly there was a lot of noise, and I ran to the window, and the street was covered in carts and vehicles, sort of flat vehicles. And there were soldiers everywhere with black feathers in their hats. And they had guns, and they had whips, and they were dragging people out of their apartments and brutally putting them on these vehicles, and people were stumbling and falling and getting kicked. It was very noisy and very nasty. And then they took everybody away. And then there was silence for a while, but because all the doors were open, suddenly there were dogs and cats everywhere. Because they took them away so suddenly, there was no time for them to take care of their pets. And there were animals running around. And I remember as a little girl being so upset about the animals in particular. And I ran downstairs and tried to get some of these dogs to my house. And a dog catcher came, and he had a long stick with a noose on it, and he had a truck, and he hooked these poor animals and put them in this truck and took it away. And I remember being very upset about this. And then my mother says to me, you can't be on the street. You see, she decided to hide me at home because she thought they wouldn't notice one little girl missing. And I was not supposed to be seen, so I wasn't allowed to run in the apartment in case the neighbors heard my footsteps. I wasn't allowed to go near the windows. I was a total prisoner, and I hated it, and I couldn't do anything. And in those days, you know, we used to buy our food in a market. There was no supermarkets as such. And we would go to the market once a week, and the rest of the time, the farmers would come with horses and carriages and ring a bell and yell out whatever they had to sell, and we'd run downstairs and buy the stuff. And there was a young woman who used to bring our milk. She came every day from her farm, and she would come with a horse and carriage, and she had a great big vat of milk in the back, and we would go downstairs and she'd measure out however much milk we wanted. And this young woman came to knock on my mother's door. 2 years before the war started, my mother found out that she was an orphan, and she was very poor, and she was getting married, and my mother made her a beautiful wedding dress. It's that dress that saved my life. I was saved by a wedding dress because Elizabeth Erzsébet, as I called her, Erzsike, when she heard that they're rounding up the Jews, knowing that my mother married a Jew, came to knock on her door, and she says, "I've come to help. You're so kind. You were so good to me. What can I do? Where's your little girl?" And my mother says, "I'm hiding her." She says, No. Give her to me. I'll take her to my farm. She'll be safe there. There's nobody there. They won't see her there. It's much too dangerous for you to have her here. Let me take her. And my mother came to me and she says, "Would you like to go to a farm?" And of course I was delighted. I hated being in the apartment. And, you know, to this day, I don't understand how courageous my mother was, taking her only spoiled, only child and handing her over to this peasant girl whom she hardly knew, and saying to me, "You're going to stay with Elizabeth in the farm." And I hopped on her carriage, and she had a little bench, little wooden bench. And I was so excited. I felt very grown up. I was almost 5 at this point, and I was holding the reins of this horse, and off we went to a farm. And we traveled quite some time because it was getting dark by the time we got there. And her farm was on the side of a hill. Her house was halfway up, and to the left of the little gate, there was a gate made of wood and bricks. And you went through the gate, and to the left of the gate was a small barn with a little attic above it. The barn had a stall for the horse and one for the cow, with a little attic above it, full of hay. They used to throw the hay up by hand. There was no hay bales. And she takes me out of the cart and she says to me, "You're staying here." I said, "What do you mean I'm staying here? Why can't I go to your house?" She says, No, you don't understand. They want to kill you. You can't go to my house. You have to hide here." And she takes me up on these rickety stairs into this smelly barn, and it's full of hay. and there's things scuttling in the hay, and there's big black furry spiders everywhere. And I start to cry, and she says, no, you don't understand. You must stay here. And she makes me a bed with some blankets. And she says, I'll come tomorrow morning and I'll bring you breakfast, but you have to stay here. And, you know, I don't understand how I stayed so quiet and so obedient. I was in that attic for 3 months, and I never yelled, and I obviously I cried, and I threw little tantrums to her, but I wasn't trying to run away from there or scream or anything, because she told me to be quiet. And, you know, I raised 4 sons. I don't think I kept them quiet more than 5 minutes. But I was silent, and, you know, I cried and I cried and I cried, and it was getting dark and there was no electricity there. And I was terrified, and going from my existence as a little princess into this dingy, smelly barn, I was terrified. And I cried myself to sleep. And this went on days on end. And Elizabeth would come several times a day to bring me food. I wasn't allowed to have toys either, because she was afraid somebody would see something. And then she would sometimes smuggle me up to her house for a bath. But most of the time I was just stuck up in that attic. And I cried and cried, and eventually I got used to being there. You can get used to things. And I started to learn to amuse myself. And I even made friends with the spiders. They were not bad spiders, they were just very ugly. And I caught one. And then I tied a string to his leg. And now I had a pet. I called him Max, and I was very happy with Max until his leg came off. And then I got very sad. And I was looking for him, and I felt guilty. I thought I killed him. But, you know, this is how I lived there for 3 months without going out, without doing anything. And it is possible to survive like that. But she kept telling me that somebody wants to kill me, and I didn't believe her. I mean, come on. What does a 5-year-old know about killing or death? You know, she kept saying they're going to try and kill you, and they'll kill me too if they find you. And, you know, I'm 85. I don't think of death. I'm sure we'll all die one day, but I don't have time for that sort of thing. Other people die, you know. I didn't believe her. I thought she just didn't want me in her house. And I didn't believe her until one morning, very early, I hear a commotion. And I look through the cracks of the barn, and I see 3 of these soldiers, again in the green uniforms, slapping this poor woman. She's standing there crying, and they're slapping her, saying, "Where's the Jew? Where's the Jew? We have information you're hiding a Jew. Why are you hiding a Jew? Do you think the Jew would hide you? Get us the Jew, or else you're going to get it. Where's the Jew?" And she says, "There's no Jew. What are you talking about? Go and look at my house." So they run up to her house, and not finding anybody there, they ransack everything. They throw furniture through the window, and they break all her dishes, and they come running very angrily out past the barn to get into their vehicle, until one of them says, "Wait a minute. Maybe the Jew is in the barn. Let's go look in the barn." Now I believed her. So I scooched under the eaves, and I pulled a lot of hay over my head, and I made myself really, really, really small. And I shut my eyes very tight. You know, when you're scared, you shut your eyes thinking if you don't see them, they won't see you. And I held my breath, but my heart was beating so loud, I was afraid they could hear me. I was terrified. And I was trying to hold my breath, and I was trying to calm my heart down. And they kept coming up the stairs, and then they came and they used their bayonets to rifle through the hay and stab the hay. And they got closer and closer. And suddenly I hear a noise, and I open an eye, and I see a big black boot next to my face. And then the bayonet comes down about an inch from my cheek, and he puts it so hard, it goes in the wood and it gets stuck right next to my face. And then he yanks it out of the wood. I remember that noise, it coming out of the wood. And they miraculously, they leave. And I think that's when my childhood really ended. I stopped being a little girl now, a spoiled little girl, center of the universe. I became a hunted animal and I was terrified. I thought they were coming back for me. I believed Elizabeth. I believed that I was going to die. And I didn't complain anymore. And I didn't even want to leave the barn. And she came and she says, it's okay, they've gone. Nothing happened. They won't come back. Don't worry. But, you know, that's when my childhood really ended. And around this time, my poor mother was arrested because somebody told them that obviously I wasn't in the ghetto, and they suspected that she hid me somewhere. And I don't know what they did to her. They kept her 2 days and a night at the police station. They tortured her. And she never told us what they did to her because she said it was too humiliating. I can just imagine. She was a pretty young woman. They must have must have raped her, done terrible things to her. She never told us. But after that, she didn't laugh as much anymore. She smiled and she occasionally giggled, but that laughter was gone. And then somehow she managed to bribe her way out of there. She had some gold coins at home, and she told one of the soldiers that she would give them the gold coins if they let her go. And she even managed to bribe them to let my father out of the ghetto. And she smuggled him out of the ghetto. He was going to walk across to Romania to escape. And before he left, he told my mother he wanted to come and say goodbye to me. And she said, it's dangerous. You don't want to do that. He said, no, I'm not leaving. The child is dependent on me. I'm close to her. She must know that I'm not abandoning her. I have to tell her it's the war, and I'll see her as soon as we can. And I want her to be secure. I want her to know that I love her. And he came walking to the farm despite what she asked him not to. And he walked all day. He got to the farm around midnight, and somebody was waiting behind the gate for him. Somebody must have tipped them off. And they arrested him. And he was on the first transport out of our town. He was taken to Auschwitz, and I never saw him again. And you know, to this day, I feel so guilty. If that man hadn't loved me so much, would he have had a different life, a different ending? Who knows? But there's nothing I can do. You know, the guilt is still with me. And then the war broke out, and my mother came to the farm to come and bring me home. And she was so happy about this war. Imagine being happy about the war. And she kept telling Elizabeth, the Russians are coming and they're going to be fine. And she told me, Daddy will come home and you can come home now. And we said goodbye to Elizabeth, and she was waving at us at the end of her road with a white handkerchief. And she went home with me, and she took me home. And I was very happy to be going home, but there was no food, there was no electricity, there was no fuel, and there was air raids every hour. The sirens went off. When I heard the news, when they started the war in Ukraine, I was 5 years old again. You know, that sound of the siren, it's exactly the same. And we'd run down to the cellar every time the siren sounded, and then they would sound the other noise that that was safe to come up, and we'd go up and down and up and down. We stopped going into the cellar. There was no point, and we just watched the war from the window. And we had no food, and we were very, very, very hungry and very cold, and it was pretty miserable. And, you know, there was a hit about 3 houses away from us. It must have been a gambling casino or something, because I remember it was snowing, playing cards. There was playing cards everywhere coming down like snow. It was spectacular. The whole street was covered in playing cards. And I so badly wanted to go and gather them, but I wasn't allowed out. And the hunger was terrible. You know, you should never feel the hunger, because I keep telling children, when I speak in schools, I said, it's not like you haven't had a meal or two. Hunger completely possesses you, your whole soul, everything. When you're hungry, all you can think about is food, and you're lightheaded, and your breath smells, and your stomach hurts, and your head hurts, and you can hardly walk. You don't have the strength, and you keep looking in drawers to see maybe somebody forgot a piece of bread. maybe somebody forgot a cookie, and you're always looking for food and trying to eat things. And people would go between the air raids and get mushrooms, but a lot of people died because they got the wrong mushrooms, you know, and there was nothing to eat. And I remember looking out the window, and there was a horse and carriage in front of our house pulling somebody's pathetic belongings. And suddenly the horse stumbled and fell right in front of our front door. And the man got out and started kicking the horse, but the horse was definitely dead. And he left it there. He took the cart away, pulled the cart away, and left the carcass there. And within minutes, doors opened and people ran out with dishes and knives and started dismembering this dead horse. And it was quite cold. And I remember as they pulled the hide off, steam was coming out of this horse. And within hours or less than an hour, there was nothing left, only the hide, a few guts, and the hoofs. We took everything, even the bones were taken for soup. And this is how this whole block of apartments survived, eating this one poor dead horse. And you know, I could no more eat a horse today than a person. I raised 2 horses here in New Hampshire from babies. They died of old age, 29 and 30 years old. I love horses, but when you're hungry, you could eat anything. And that hunger has never, you know, you never recover completely from hunger. I still can't throw food away, you know. I eat the leftovers, you know, you can tell. I eat leftovers. You know, whenever I go to speak at the school and they know I'm a Holocaust survivor, they give you, you know, school clothing or T-shirts. They always give you the little ones because they think you're skinny because you're a survivor. I say, excuse me, can I have the big size, please? But it does affect you. And, you know, I'll never forget that feeling of hunger. I have such respect for food even now, you know. Hunger stays with you. A lot of things like that stay with you. And then they stopped the bombings, and the Russians started coming across the river. The river we could see from our house, it was frozen, and the Russian soldiers were coming down the opposite embankment, holding arms and singing, coming across the frozen river up on this side and being machine gunned. I never seen anything like it. They must have been drunk because they came in waves and waves being killed, you know. This is obviously how they fight their wars, by just throwing more people in. And they must have been drunk because they kept singing and dying and singing and dying and coming across the river. And eventually there were so many corpses opposite our house, you couldn't see the river anymore. And we were under Russian occupation. Well, they were not warm and fuzzy like my mother thought. They were horrible. They were raping people and killing people and robbing everybody. And they had this total mania for wristwatches. You could buy your life with a wristwatch, because once they started getting enough watches, they would have 5 or 6 on each arm. And I still remember they were yelling, "Davai chas," which means give me a watch, and "Davai barishnya," give me a woman, basically in that order. And so my mother and all the women from the apartment building were hiding in our house behind a false wall. They were terrified. So my mother decided to take matters in her hands, and she decided to go and meet the local commander, see if she could get some help. But she couldn't go out looking the way she did. She was a pretty young woman. So she made herself look old. She put on a very old gray dress, and she put a pillow under the dress on her back to make herself look like a hunchback. And she blackened her teeth, and she painted her face with lines, and she put chalk in her hair, and she bent double with a scarf, and she pretended to be a very, very old woman. And she walked to the local commander, who, to her surprise, was a young woman. By this time, the Russians lost so many people that they were starting to promote very young people and women to high positions. And to her surprise, this young woman, who was a very pretty young woman, who was a commander in her uniform, my mother said to her with the interpreter, "Listen, come to my house. I'm a dressmaker. I'll make you a pretty dress. That uniform doesn't really do anything for you." And the woman came, and my mother unhooked the drape and she put it on her. And all the women who were hiding were busy making dresses for Russian soldier women. And suddenly we had food, and we had a chicken and butter and bread and even chocolate. And everybody got very ill, because when you've been starving, you're not supposed to eat suddenly. I mean, some of them were ill for a long time. And it took us a couple of weeks to calm down and not eat everything that we could find, and started to become normal again. But we still couldn't go out. So my mother said to the commander, "Can we have a guard?" And yes, they gave us 2 guards. They gave us a young soldier. His name was Ivan, tall, blonde kid, can't have been more than 17. By this time, he was a captain. And his sidekick was a heavy older gentleman with an accordion, who was always playing and singing. And these guys were drunk all the time. I've never seen people drink like that. They came with great big bottles of vodka. Then they proceeded to drink my mother's cologne. They found some methylated spirits in the kitchen. They drank that too. And they were constantly drunk. And they were kind of disorderly. They were shooting at the moldings in the ceiling and burning our antique furniture for heat. But I liked them. They were very nice. You know, there are 2 kinds of drunks. They're miserable drunks and happy drunks. These Russians were happy drunks. They taught me Russian dances and Russian songs, and I loved Ivan. I thought he was great. And I had great fun with them. And one day, Ivan decided to bring my mother a gift. As you know, a Hungarian housewife, what's the greatest gift you can give her is a goose liver. So he brings a goose liver, has a bit of blood on it. He comes into the apartment and he looks for somewhere to wash it. Coming from somewhere where they had no running water, he looks around, he finds a toilet, puts the liver in the toilet, washes it, and it's still a bit bloody, looks around, pulls the chain, the liver goes away. He shoots the toilet, the toilet explodes, water everywhere. I think this is great. My mother doesn't. But that was Ivan, you know, it depends. It depends how you envisage things. Excuse me 1 second. I always tell people it's not vodka. Especially in schools, you know, once a kid in a school said to me, "What's in the bottle?" I said, "What do you think is in the bottle in a school, really?" Anyhow, so by this time, you know, I remember I got a present from Ivan too. I was ill in bed and I had a fever, and he brought me this parcel wrapped in white paper. And I remember opening it, and it was like the rising sun. It was an orange. I had never seen an orange before. People didn't import fruit then. There was no refrigeration and importation. We ate what grew there. And I knew about oranges. I saw them in fairy stories. But this orange was beautiful, and it smelled so good. And I remember the odor. Oh my God, it was amazing. And my mother opened it up and gave me some to eat, and then she candied the rest. And I was only allowed to eat it when I was sick. And I wanted to be sick all the time because I love the orange. And to this very day, there's always an orange in my house. It's my security, you know. And I don't know what happened at this point. The Russians left town, the garrison left, and I said goodbye to Ivan. And Ivan, I remember, he said that he was going to come back and marry me when I was 17. I wonder if he ever came back, but probably not, because drinking the way he did, he probably died before he was 50. I mean, Russian men don't live very long if they drink like that. It was unbelievable. So anyway, things started to turn sort of sad and normal. My mother had a hard time feeding us because, you know, people weren't having dresses made, but she still managed to barter, you know, work for food. And we ate, we had food, and Elizabeth was still giving us food from the farm. And one day she heard that there were trains coming back from Poland, 3 trains coming to our town. And she was very excited, and she says, you know, Daddy's going to come home. My mother believed that Daddy was at a work camp because nobody wanted to believe that there were concentration camps like we heard. They thought it was just propaganda, and they didn't want to believe that Germany, the most cultured, civilized country in the world, could have something like concentration camps. They didn't believe it. And she just thought that people were coming home from the work camp. And we went to the railway station. She dressed me in a nice dress and did my hair. And I was so excited. I was wondering if Daddy will recognize me and will he be proud of me? You know, I was so excited. And I remember going to the railway station, and we were standing there, and we held up this picture of my father, asking people, have you seen this man? 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 And the train emptied and there was no Daddy. Daddy wasn't on the train. And I remember being very, very upset. And we went home crying. And then my mother, who normally became a problem solver, she said, tomorrow he'll be on the next train. He's not going to forget to come home. He's going to be here. And we went on the next day, and the people who came off the train scared me because they didn't look human. They were in rags and they had no hair and they were covered in sores, and you couldn't tell if they were men or women. They didn't walk, they shuffled. They looked like ghosts. And my mother gathered these people up and brought them home, and she gave them baths, and she gave them her clothes to the women and my father's clothes to the men. And they were sitting in our living room talking and telling us these dreadful stories. And I wasn't supposed to hear this, but I couldn't help it. I hid under a table or behind a sofa, and I was listening to all these horror stories about what they did to these poor people. And it was just very sad. And I was very scared for my daddy. I was terrified. And we went back on the third day, because she said he'll be on the last train. And we're standing there with a picture, and a man comes to my mother and says, don't wait for him, he's dead. She says, what do you mean he's dead? I saw his body, he's dead. She says, well, what's he ill? What happened? And she says to him, anyway, how do you know who I am and who are you? And he says, you don't recognize me. He was one of the closest friends of my parents, but he was in such bad shape. My parents used to go and play cards at his coffee house. He had a coffee house, hotel coffee house, sort of a card playing place. They used to play cards there every Sunday night. And this poor man, who was also a violinist, they broke all his fingers at the camp, and they didn't set it, so he had hands like claws. He scared me. And he was in such bad shape that my mother didn't recognize him. And he came and he told my mother, she brought him home, and he told my mother about what happened to him. He and his wife and little daughter called Dita, who was 11 years old at the time, were deported together. The little girl, who was a very talented child, she played 3 musical instruments, and she wanted to be an actress when she grew up. And they took them to Auschwitz, and after the 4 days and nights in the train, they got to the railway station in Auschwitz. They emptied the train. The mother and the child were marched off to one side and the father to the other. And the father said to one of the guards, where are they going? And the guard pointed to a chimney. And the poor man didn't understand, because we didn't believe it. But later he realized that his daughter and his wife were taken directly to the gas chambers and burnt on the same day, because that's what happened with the Hungarians who were arriving right at the end. Even if they were too old to work, or even if they had any kind of disability, or if they were walking slowly, they would just march them directly to the gas chambers. And this poor man was totally broken. And my mother said to him, so what are you going to do? And he says, well, we left everything with our housekeeper. I'm going to go tomorrow and get some of my things back. And he knocked on her door the next morning, and she opens the door wearing his wife's dress and says, oh, so they didn't kill all of you. The Russians took it all. And she slams the door in his face. And he comes back and he says, I have nothing. She wouldn't give me anything. I don't know what to do. I can't do anything. And she says, well, just stay until you feel a bit better. And, you know, he stayed, and over many, many months, out of two broken families, we cobbled together a new one, and he became my stepfather. But he never became my daddy, and I never became Dita, because you don't replace people. But we somehow managed to have a life together. And he was a very kind man. He was a very good stepfather, but it took him an awful long time to be able to even talk about anything, you know. I had to actually get it out of him in little bits and pieces. He couldn't talk about what happened to him, the dreadful things that happened to him. And, you know, I remember when we came to America, he came with me to America, he had Alzheimer's and he was on his deathbed, and I was holding his hand, and he kept calling me Dita, his daughter's name. And I was so happy to be able to give him that last little bit of happiness, to imagine his beautiful, wonderful daughter was still alive. And when I was about 9, he told me how my father died, because he saw it. We didn't tell my mother. My father and another man from our town stole a piece of bread because they were starving. And the commander found out, and they decided to make an example of these men. And they took the 2 men and stripped them naked, and it was kind of cold. And they beat them with iron bars, breaking most of their bones. And they put each man in a dog kennel in this big field where they had to stand every day and be counted. And they left them there to die. And it took my father 2 days and a night to die in agony. And when I discovered this, I became completely obsessed with revenge. All I wanted to do was kill the people who hurt my daddy, who hurt these people. I had visions of murder and how to stab and how to poison. And I was so full of hatred. And it took me 50 years to stop hating. I don't hate anymore. Because if your heart is full of hatred, there's no room for anything else. And I refuse to hate. I refuse to hate. And now I'm sort of, you know, people say, well, what do you do? I said, well, I suppose I love, yes. But above all, I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor. Because when you become a victim, they win, and they didn't win. I won. I'm a success story because I'm alive. I'm alive. And not only am I alive, I have 4 sons. And every time I gave birth to one of my sons, I was giving the finger to Hitler. I'm alive. And not only that, but you know, not only do I have 4 sons, but I have 4 granddaughters. And I have a new little grandson and another granddaughter coming, 10 fingers to Hitler. And you know, I have a wonderful multicultural family. I have grandchildren of all different sizes and shapes and ethnicities. I have one who's half Chinese, half Mexican. I have one who's half, what else? Yeah, I also have one who is half German, believe it or not. One of my sons came and told me he was getting married to this wonderful Canadian actress. And I said, wonderful. Nice. I'm so happy. He says, well, there's a slight problem. I said, what? Daddy was in the German army. So I swallowed, and I swallowed again. And she became my daughter-in-law. And I remember when I was holding their baby in my arms, a beautiful child, you know, a beautiful, beautiful baby girl, the granddaughter of a perpetrator and the victim. And the tears were just pouring. And I was thinking, no, this is good. This is what has to happen. We have to go forward. We cannot go back. We have to stop it happening, but we cannot go back. We cannot go with hatred in our hearts. We have to go forward with love and hope. And that sort of closed the circle for me. I realized that basically that's what we have to do. And you know, I don't have to tell you that there's still horrible things going on even now. And there is no cure for this. But I do have a lot of respect for Germany, because it's the only country that actually owned up to being guilty. They gave reparations. In Germany, you cannot fly a Nazi flag like you can in America. You cannot fly a Nazi flag there. You can't buy Mein Kampf and read it because it's against the law. And I often tell kids, I mean, why would anybody want to fly a Nazi flag? I mean, don't they know they lost the war? Why join the losers? Go with the winners, for God's sake. How stupid is that? I mean, what does that tell you? But, you know, it's really very interesting because I can't help feeling that you have to stand up and be counted no matter who you are. And even us Jews have to stand up and be counted. Whenever we see prejudice, we have to stop it because we know what it's like. We know what it's like. And I remember I was listening to a wonderful lecture by Mr. Ferenc, who was one of the prosecutors in Nuremberg. And he was talking about when his parents came to America, they were simple people, the shoemaker or something. And his father would seat his two children, young children, at the table every night and say to them, "What have you done for humanity today?" And the children had to do one good little thing every single day, whether opening a door or feeding a dog or helping someone across the road, picking up litter. And I always tell kids they have to do one good thing every day because you can save the world by one good deed. Just smile at that poor person who looks sad. You never know what packages they're carrying, what baggage everybody has, what tragedies people have in their lives. Because we're all the same. I mean, you know, like I often get very annoyed when people say to me, "You don't look Jewish." I said, "Wait till I show you my tail." You know, I get very annoyed at this idea of us being such others. I mean, and yet at the same time, when you were singing that song, my soul was really soaring because suddenly I realized that we are here. They didn't get us. We are a success story. I'm a success story. I'm an unbelievable success story because I have a whole generation of people only because of this simple peasant girl who couldn't even read or write because she did the right thing. Because she did the right thing. And if everybody would only do the right thing, you know, I don't understand why this hatred can still be here. But you know, it's not only Jews they hate Muslims, they hate somebody all the time. At the moment, we are fashionable, you know. It's a big fashion to be anti-Semitic. About 2 years ago, it was the Muslims, wasn't it? Yeah, they picked on somebody else, and maybe they'll pick on somebody else soon, you know. But the only thing we can do is teach people and love people, because if you let the bullies make you into a victim and into a frightened person, they win. And I'm not going to let them win. They didn't kill us then, they're not going to kill us now. And we can talk to people and we can possibly change them with love, because that's the best weapon. I mean, if you love your enemies, it really kills them. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. And, you know, education is about the only thing that we can do, seriously. And I truly think, how many kids in school are in this room? Can you stand up a second? Wow, wonderful. Thank you. You guys are going to change the world. Thank you. You can sit down. I tell you why. I tell you why, because you are different from generations. I used to speak for about 15 years now, and the generation before you were talking about success and money and fame. You guys are talking about the environment, about the fact that you don't care if somebody's blue, green, yellow, gay, straight. You don't want to live in your father's basement when you're 55. A different generation, and you guys will have to save the world because nobody else is going to do it for you. I'm afraid we didn't leave you a great world. But mind you, it wasn't that great in 1939 when I was born. And I remember saying to my youngest son who had this new baby, I said, "How can you have a baby in this environment?" He said, "Mom, you were born in 39. I said, "Yeah, but it wasn't easy. It was tough." On the other hand, I'm hoping it won't be as tough for you, but you guys have a tremendous weapon in your hand, that phone that you have. Because when I was a kid, we didn't know news or anything like that. We had radios and newspapers controlled by the governments. We didn't have the information. You guys can now get the information. You have a network that you can do. You can rise against evil. We didn't have the tools. We were hampered by not knowing, by not having the communication. You guys can do it, and you guys will have to do it, because unless you do it, nobody's going to do it for you. I just want to close with something that I heard from Churchill. He had better English than me. He was speaking during the World War II, during the bombings, and he said, "Hear this, young men and women everywhere, proclaim it far and wide. The earth is yours and the fullness thereof. Be kind, but be fierce. You are needed now more than ever before. Take up the mantle of change. Change the world, for this is your time." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And now you can see I don't have any filters, so you can ask me anything you like.
So we're going to take a few questions. So if you do have a question for Kati, please raise your hand and I'll come to you with a microphone so we can all hear your question.
There's a question there. Are you going to get your exercise today?
Kati, how long did your family live in Hungary and where did you go after that?
I was 11 when we left. We emigrated to Israel. And that was difficult too, because you see, my stepfather, who adopted me at the time, said they're only allowing people of low class to leave. If you had any kind of education, you weren't supposed to. So he came to me and he said to me, "We're taking pictures to get the permits. You have to look stupid." And I did. You should see that picture. I look like an idiot. And then he had a 5 o'clock shadow and my mother's hair was all messed up. And we really looked a pathetic family, and they let us go. They let us go. And I remember we went on this boat. We went on a boat called Transylvania, of all things, out of Constanța in Romania. And it was a boat for maybe 200 people. There was like 800 of us on there. It was full of cockroaches and rats. And we had to take turns sleeping. And the person who was awake had to watch that no cockroaches and rats crawled on you while you slept. And oh, it was horrible. But I remember going into Haifa Bay, and it was a beautiful morning. And Haifa Bay is very beautiful. The Mount Carmel is very pretty. And there was an old man at the very front, very old, very religious man, who was praying. And as soon as he was able to get off the boat, he fell down on the ground and he kissed it. I'll never forget that. He just sat and kissed the ground and kissed the ground. It was very emotional. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. But leaving Romania, we weren't allowed to take anything. You know, we were only allowed the luggage we had in our hand. And I had a little gold chain with a Star of David that my father had given me. That was my prized possession. And the woman who was checking us tore it off my neck and actually cut my neck. She took it from me and put it in her pocket. I remember that. Anybody else? Yes.
I just want to say thank you very much. And my father's from Transylvania too.
Yes.
And your stories were very similar to what he experienced. I know when he went back to
I come from Preston here.
and he,
Kozlov. És aludtam Magyarországon.
Magyarországon.
Románországban van.
Igen.
Németül beszélek. Franciát
That's
beszélek.
right. I forgot Romanian. I forgot Romanian.
Nyelven.
but he also,
És 12.800 a szám a nemem.
A mostoha apám volt 10.810.
És hány éven voltam? Mondva Metsző 13 és 14-ben már voltam Auschwitzba.
Amazing. Amazing. He made it.
És te magad nem mondta, hogyha menjed 2 hétig, jöjjön és megéreztem, érkezem Auschwitzba. És Birkenauba, hol adtak
Hál' Isten, hogy itt van. Wonderful. Thank you. He made it. Amazing, isn't it?
Nagyon száz!
I'm amazed. I'm amazed. You see, when I tell my story, mine was really nothing compared to what some other people lived. Yeah, but his was worse. His was worse. I was not in a camp. I escaped. And
The lady who helped out in the house, she knew Hebrew better than he, and she would say, "You're not saying this right," you know. And it's amazing that the way you said express the same information. And when he went back to his house afterwards, you know, he went back to go recover his
Yes.
belongings. Come back tomorrow. Come back tomorrow.
Mhm.
And same thing. It's amazing.
You know, I never actually saw a German Nazi. My whole persecution happened by Hungarian neighbors and friends. And that is what really upsets me. And you know, my hometown that had 30,000 Jews, 300 of us survived, 300 out of 30,000. And there's not a memorial plaque in that town, not a mention of Jews in Oradea, which is called now Nagyvárad, not a mention, nothing. The Jewish cemetery is walled up. You can't go in there because they don't want people to wreck it. And that's it. I mean, there's no memory of it. That's what upsets me more than anything. They wipe these people off the face of the earth. I have no grave to go to. I have nothing to go to. And when I'm dead, little Dita won't be remembered either, because that little girl became like my sister because my stepfather told me so much about her. And I sort of inherited her life that she should have had. And that's what annoys me more than anything, is the wiping away of people. Nobody has a right to completely wipe people off the face of the earth so nobody remembers them once they're dead. That's all.
We have a question.
Yeah, sorry.
I had a cousin who was married to a survivor. She was in a camp in Netherlands,
Yeah.
and all through her life, she would never talk about her experiences. It was too painful. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about, you said like, you know, only until about 15 years ago, that's when you really started talking
Yes,
about
I
it in
start-
earnest. I was wondering if you could talk about it more, what made you decide to do that?
Well, several things. I didn't tell you, well, even when I was a child, you know, the very first time that I experienced anti-Semitism, my mother gave me a yellow star because everybody was supposed to wear them if they went outside. And I went for a walk with my mother with a yellow star, and a man came opposite and he looked at me, and I sort of very proudly showed him my star, and he spat in my face and it ran down my cheek onto my star. And I said to my mother, he hates stars, you know, and never occurring to me. And then I could no longer go to sit on my favorite bench in the park. No going to the movies, no going to a coffee house. We weren't allowed to go anywhere. We were completely ostracized. And then, you know, what happens when you're a Holocaust survivor, you tend to be, I've become a nasty little overachiever. And I was very successful because I wanted my life to count. So I thought if I succeeded in things, I would sort of give it a sort of stamp of approval that I'm alive. And so I had several very successful things. I was a model, I was a journalist, I was a fashion designer in London for 30 years. I made a lot of money. I came to America, I had a theater company. I was constantly ambitious and ambitious. And then when I got to an older age, when I finally discovered what I want to do when I grow up, I realized that this is what I need to do. It took me this long to realize that this is more important. This is so much more important than what I did before. And you know, I'm so happy doing what I do. And I consider myself nouveau poor because that's much better class. But I realized that the money that I made, the success and all the write-ups in the newspapers didn't do it for me. This is what matters. And every time I speak to a school and I get so much love from these kids, that's my therapy. And that has opened me up to be able to talk, because it took me maturity to be able to talk about it.
Thank you. Let's see if we have any more questions.
Oh my God, such a quiet group. I never heard so many Jews so quiet. You know, I just thought today that you're really a captive audience here, aren't you? Yes, back there.
Could you like expand like what it was like in like the barn house? Did you like share a room with any like animals like horses or cows or something?
In the barn where I was hidden. There was a cow downstairs and a horse, and they were very smelly. And I had Max the spider, but there were no other animals. There were mice, but I couldn't catch them. And I did not see another soul other than Elizabeth 3 months there. And I was alone. I was completely alone. There was no dogs and cats. I don't remember any, at least not in the barn. It's amazing. It's amazing that a child can be alone that long. But it did teach me how to amuse myself. And even now, if I'm alone, I'm quite okay. I don't feel lonely. I never feel lonely.
We can take one more question if someone has it. Yeah. Coming to you, Delilah.
You said that from the school you went to that you met one of the other survivors from that school.
Oh, yeah.
What was that like meeting him?
Okay, I was at a cocktail party in London, and I was invited to a political get-together, some very posh people. They were drinking champagne, talking about the poor, you know, that kind of party. And, you know, we were all having canapes and champagne and saying how terrible it is that people are poor. And suddenly I hear a woman who sounded like me. And I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, "Who are you?" And we started talking, and we both realized who the other was. And I remember we were screaming and yelling and crying and jumping up and down and hugging. And all these English people were looking down their noses at us because you don't behave like that in public, but we couldn't care. She was wonderful. And I was so happy. Can you imagine the chance? What are the chances that the cocktail party in Hampstead, London, I meet this woman? She was a doctor. Unfortunately, she died a few years later of cancer, but I was so happy to have seen her. It was unbelievable. She was saved by a maid who hid her in an attic. There were good people, but few and far between. Not enough. Unfortunately, Hungary and Poland were two of the worst countries for people helping Jews survive. There were many more people in other countries, but Hungary and Poland was pretty bad. I don't know why, but it was.
Kati, thank you so much.
Thank
for
you
coming.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are so fortunate to be able to have you here with us today.
Let's be alive. Am Israel Chai.